Winter gardening has completely changed how I think about gardening in general. It's low-key, hands-off, and in New Hampshire, it is so nice to go out there in the dead of winter and just pick greens for a salad for dinner. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, I wanted to give you my top 10 tips on how to get the most out of winter gardening for you. So tip number 1 is making sure that you understand in your area how much daylight you get during the winter. So when it comes to plants, they need at least 10 hours of sunlight to grow in order to put on any bulk. So the goal with winter gardening is to make sure that your plants are pretty much full size before you get to that cutoff of when days in your area are less than 10 hours. So in our area, between about November 4th to February 2nd, the days are shorter than 10 hours. So during that time period, the plants won't be actively growing, but we can still harvest from them. So the goal is to get those plants up to a size where we can harvest from them before November 4th. Once those days get longer in February, those plants are really going to explode and they're going to grow away really fast. So the bulk of what you're going to be harvesting in your area is probably going to be after that date in late winter, early spring, when the days start to be more than 10 hours again. Tip number 2 is making sure you select the right plants for winter sowing. Not just any plant will work for this method, at least not in cold climates. If you're in a warmer climate, feel free to experiment with absolutely everything. And by warmer, I mean probably zone 7 or 8 and warmer. But if you're in a colder zone, you need to be looking for things that will grow well in the colder seasons. So on those seed packets, you want to be looking for words like frost tolerant, good for spring and fall growing, and you also want to be looking for plants with a shorter maturity date. When it comes to the maturity date for seeds, I usually assume that the plants are going to take about twice as long to grow as it says on the seed packet because the days are shorter. So I try to look for seeds that usually have a maturity date between, say, 30 and 50 days. With tip number 3, we're going to start preparing the garden beds for winter growing. To prep for sowing, if the bed is empty, I like to add a layer of compost and some biotone starter fertilizer and just mix that into the top layer of the soil before I start planting the seeds. But I usually start these seeds for winter sowing when the garden is still full of plants. So the tomatoes are there, the peppers, all those things. So instead of ripping all those out at the end of summer, I just scatter the seeds underneath them. And I might, use my fingers and kind of zhuzh them into the soil a bit, but usually I just water them in and whatever sprouts, sprouts. And at the end of the season, I'll come in and I'll cut off the summer vegetables at the soil surface so I'm not disturbing the plants that are growing underneath them. As far as when to start the seeds that you're growing, that's going to depend on where that last day of 10 hours of light happens in your area. For me, I usually try to start my seeds about 8 to 10 weeks before that date. So now we're up to tip 4, setting up the winter protection. This method is all about growing simply without adding extra heat, because you could have a heated greenhouse and you could get away with growing a lot more, but I don't want to be dealing with electricity out in my garden all winter long. So instead, when it comes to cold climates, it's about setting up a layered level of protection that helps to take your garden and move it essentially 2 zones warmer than where you are. So here we're zone 5, zone 6, and we can end up growing things under the tent that are getting a climate that's more similar to zone 7 or zone 8. If you're in zones colder than zone 7, you're going to need the 2-layer setup that I'm talking about here. If you're in zones that are warmer than that, you can probably get away with either just the frost cloth or just the greenhouse cover. It really depends on how often you get frost and what your winter really looks like. For us, we're doing the 2 levels of protection. So on the inner level, we have some simple wire hoops that are going to support a frost cloth or frost blanket. And I'll be linking down below to the supplies that we use so you can take a look at that. And we just hold that in place with clothespins. This is going to be under protection, so it's not going anywhere. For the outside layer, we use a greenhouse plastic, and that's going to give us that extra bit of protection. In our garden, we just hold it down around the edges with stones and rocks, because then it's pretty easy to just take the stones and rocks off when we want to harvest. The greenhouse film that we've been using, I think we've used it for 2 or 3 seasons now, and it's still holding up just fine. It holds up to heavy snow loads as long as you go out there and whack the snow off the top. The soil inside, I want it to be slightly moist, but I don't want it to be too wet or too dry. So if you pick it up and it like sticks in the ball when you make a fist, then it's a little too wet. I want it to be like a kind of a loose crumbling texture, but it still feels moist. Tip number 5 is about managing the temperature. There's probably a good way to keep track of the temperature inside your greenhouse, but we've tried a lot of different methods over the years, and the humidity that's inside those greenhouses messes with every method we've tried. So instead of trying to figure out what the inside temp is, I rely more on the outside temperature. If the greenhouse is in full sun and the temperature outside is above 40 degrees, that's when I'm going to go outside and first of all definitely harvest, but also check to see what the temperature is like inside, just putting my hand in there. There are days where it can easily get up over 80 degrees inside a greenhouse like that if it's in full sun. Our garden is in full shade all winter long, so I never really have to vent the greenhouse at all until we get to late February, March. But if your garden is in full sun, then that's something you're going to want to check a little more often, just to make sure that the plants aren't getting too hot. Tip number 6 is about pests. Now, one of the benefits of growing in winter is that there aren't a lot of pests. There aren't a lot of diseases. There's not a lot of work really that you have to do. There are a few pests though that might cause you some problems. So it doesn't seem to matter when I plant anything in the brassica family, those cabbage white butterflies are going to find them and they are going to get covered in caterpillars. So I don't plant any brassicas anymore, and that includes in winter growing. Somehow they find them late in the season and the caterpillars eat everything up. So if you have any problems like that, just skip the plant. It's just easier than trying to deal with whatever the pest is. The other potential issue is voles. Now, voles are a difficult thing to deal with. If you've ever had them in your garden, you know how much of a pain they can be. One of the best ways to deal with them when it comes to winter growing is just to make sure that the area around your little mini greenhouse is clear of snow at all times. They, in winter especially, want to be able to move around underneath the snow. So if you have it cleared on all sides, then it at least gives them a bit of a pause that maybe they're not going to want to go there and check out what you have inside that tent. We also have our raised beds built up, I think about 16 inches tall, which has kept voles out entirely. We haven't had any issues. Tip 7 is about plants. These are the ones that work best in our area. I'm going to talk a little bit about what to do if you don't know what will work in your area. But around here, spinach and winter hardy lettuces work really well. Spinach is a good one in general because it doesn't rely so much on daylight as a lot of the other plants do. So it'll continue growing, albeit slowly, throughout the whole winter. Also, claytonia and corn salad, or also called, I think it's mash, that grows perfectly fine in our area, even without any cover. So it just comes up in the vegetable beds, grows all winter long as those plants aren't covered in snow or the temperature is above freezing. We can harvest those straight from the garden without cover all winter long in zone 5 and 6. Tip 8 is about something I learned last year. Some of these plants will reseed themselves in the garden, and then they just start growing up again in the summer or in the fall when they need to, and they take away and they grow all winter long just by themselves. For us, that's claytonia and mash or corn salad. If I let those go to seed in the spring, which they do before I need those beds again for summer vegetables, the seeds drop in the bed, and then when they are ready to sprout in the fall, they come up on their own. So they're growing up underneath our tomatoes and peppers and everything else that we have out there right now, just on their own. Now, the first year I did this, I found out that claytonia in particular reseeds really, really well. So if you're not careful, they can take over the entire space that you're growing in. But my goal is to pretty much never have to sow for winter sowing ever again. So I just want the plants to grow, seed themselves in the same area, and I'm just going to keep that going. Tip number 9 is if you're not sure about what you can grow in your area. What I would do in that situation is I would plan on setting up just one of these greenhouse tents in whatever kind of space you have. Let's say it's a 4x8 bed. And I would get a bunch of seed packets that fit what we talked about before. So they're frost hardy, they're cold tolerant, they're good for spring and fall. And then I would just sprinkle them. I just plant them in that bed. I wouldn't even worry about it too much. I'd probably just scatter them everywhere. My goal for that first year would be to see what grows really well, just to kind of gauge where you are in your area. Tip number 10. If you're just setting up your garden this fall, or you're ready to set it up in the spring and you're interested in winter growing, one of the biggest bits of advice I can give you is make sure when you're laying out your beds that you leave enough space in between them for at least a snow shovel or a snowblower if you have one. Especially if you're in a snowy climate, you want to make sure that you can clear all the way around that mini greenhouse that you've set up so that you have easy access to it. So I hope you find those tips helpful in your winter gardening this year. If you have any questions, be sure to drop those down in the comments below. And be sure to check out this video right here, which will give you some more information about how we set up our winter gardening last year.